So.
See, if they start to try to tear the door down.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, so some of these questions will be about your specific experience on the lookout, and we know you work separate lookouts, so you can just,
chime in.
Yeah.
Okay.
Share, respond in whatever way. But I guess we'll start. The first question that we have here is, can you just tell us about yourselves? First, start by introducing yourselves, your names, and where you're from, and just tell us a little bit about your life here in Idaho, and how you're spending your time.
Okay. Yeah. My name is Jim Huntley, and this is my wife, Caroline.
I'm Caroline.
And I grew up in upstate New York, Saratoga Springs, at the base of the Adirondack Park, and got into hiking at a pretty young age and really enjoyed it. And so when I turned about 18, 19, headed west and did some traveling up in Alaska and whatnot, and came down to Idaho after I was done up there, and came to Sandpoint. And Sandpoint was very similar to Alaska, so although it was in the lower 48. So that's what drew me to this spot. And so kind of ended up settling here, just fell in love with the woods and the natural environment here. And so ended up going to college in Boulder, Colorado. And that's where I met Caroline. We worked together. And then when I graduated from Naropa University, we flew Boulder and came back up to Sandpoint and bought this property, and here we are, still here doing the homestead thing. Would you like to?
Yeah, so I'm Caroline Huntley, and I grew up in Connecticut, so on the East Coast too, but then moved out to Colorado when I was a teenager, and then 10 years later, Jim and I met where we were working at a resort in the mountains, and he was living in a wall tent, and I was living in a little cabin trailer, and we just fell in love on a road trip up to Idaho up here, and visiting hot springs, and we just loved the ability just to be able to pull over on the side of the road and find a little tent spot in the woods, and so we just that was what we did for fun, and then when we were in Colorado, Jim, our first summer together, just thought it would be really great to revisit doing the lookout, and so he tried to get a job with a few different forests, and then ended up getting a job at the Payette National Forest, and so that's when we left Colorado, and we got the job at the Fire Lookout, and then that kind of really opened up our whole world of Idaho. So once we were doing that, I'm sure we'll kind of chat a little bit more about lookout things, but after our first summer here, we just realized that this was home, and so we have our little homestead here, and we're just living simply, and
yep, and, totally off the grid, and from somewhat from scratch, building didn't have any plumbing or electrical when we first moved in, so we did all the woodwork in there, and put the solar in and water systems and all that stuff. So it's kind of been a hobby of sorts, just living simply and trying to provide our own food has been a big priority for us with this spot in specific. But it's kind of a hobby, and just keeps us moving,
So you both.
Oh, hold on. You guys can drop those. Those recorders. You don't have to hold them.
Oh,
just
okay.
just put them on the ground, or
oh, okay.
wherever.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to make you hold on to those.
Oh no,
That's
no,
okay. It's my fault.
no, they're
So you started on the lookouts the same summer in Idaho?
yeah. Jim was the actual lookout, and I was the volunteer there. So
Okay.
yeah,
And that was at Pilot Peak.
at Pilot Peak.
Yep.
Yeah.
And 2006, and that was really big fire year too. So 2006, 2007 were some of the biggest fire years in that neck of the woods. And really, the history that I remember, we haven't seen fires like that, in recent times. So
Yeah, we had a string of thunderstorms that just kind of kept moving down the South Fork of the Salmon, right along where we were, and just fire after fire after fire. And that was kind of our rookie year too. So we were like constantly sitting on like the lightning stools together, just like sharing one and watching just lightning strikes everywhere, and kind of our just getting our feet wet and the whole thing. But you had actually done the fire lookout in upstate New York, so you
Yeah.
had that training, but it probably was a little bit different than.
it was. I was technically a summit steward, so I would just, kind of watch people and make sure they're not leaving garbage behind, stepping on plants, stuff like that, but I wasn't really there for fire detection, even though, hey, if a smoke popped up, I would call it in, but I was more just a live-in ranger. But it was an 80-foot steel tower, and, kind of like the one she manned at Carrie Dome Lookout for a couple of years, and had a little cabin down at the bottom, and so yeah, that was a good gig. But 2006 we started together, and then we decided to do separate lookouts just to try and make more money. So I stayed at Pilot Peak for another 2 seasons, I think, after that, and then you were at Carrie Dome for that time period. And then when Sheep Eater opened up, I bumped out to Sheep Eater, and Caroline moved back into Pilot Peak, and that's where we kind of stayed.
He went to Sheep Eater because he was always in love with the notion of being in the most remote lookout, and in fact, when you got the job for Pilot Peak, that was one of the things that the ranger was kind of, or the AFMO was asking him what he was interested in, and he said like you wanted the most remote lookout that was possible, and so Pilot Peak was the most remote lookout on the district, so that was satisfying in that way. And then we could also see Sheep Eater on the Frank Church Wilderness just from Pilot Peak, and you always kind of had your eye out on that lookout. And the lookout who had been there for, gosh, she'd been there for 20 years, something like that.
Yeah.
So she held the post for a really long time. So when it came open, it was a pretty big deal, and so you were really excited about that, and that was a really neat opportunity for you to get out there and do that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Renee Hill.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're gonna try to get in touch with her too.
Nice.
Oh, good. Yeah.
So, I guess so many questions kind of popping up just hearing you both talk, but I wanted to stay with Pilot Peak for a second in your first season there, and maybe we've been asking people to describe the view from the lookout, so maybe if you could both maybe describe the view from Pilot Peak, and maybe say a little bit more about the experience of manning that lookout together.
Yeah, absolutely. The view from Pilot Peak is spectacular. I think every lookout has a beautiful view, I think, but Pilot Peak is really dramatic. It is set right on the South Fork of the Salmon, on a really steep peak, so it just really drops off about 5,000 feet down to the Salmon. So you get this real stunning view to the south and the north of the whole drainage there. So you really get the advantage of just seeing all the different drainages that kind of run into it, but then it also, the contrast of the steep peaks really give that sense of elevation, and that you're like really in the mountains there. So that's pretty stunning. And the sunsets, of course, are just gorgeous, and really catch the light. And there's something really special, I think, about the Salmon River Mountains. They're pretty steep, and then there are these beautiful, lodgepole pines and ponderosa pines that kind of dot the ridges. So it's pretty stunning in that way. And then you're also, you see like 3, 4, I guess 5 other lookouts in that vein. You have Miners Peak, Williams Peak, War Eagle, Sheep Eater, and then Oregon Butte across the way. So those are some of the things that kind of stand out in my mind of the view.
Yeah. It's Lodgepole Ponderosa Forest, and Pilot Peak had been burnt before we got there, and then in the, what was it, the Chicken Peak fire in the late 90s or something like that. But so it was pretty burnt, a lot of snags, but the wildflowers were really amazing, and like this time of the year they're really going off, or starting to up there. And so, yeah, you look down off of Pilot Peak, and it'd just be a sea of, look like someone had, like, tossed Skittles everywhere, just so many flowers. And,
Yeah, it's gorgeous.
Pilot had a feel of being like you were like in a ship, because the peak was so prominent and just stood alone. And so all around you, it just felt like was sky, and the wind would blow, and the light was really nice, and it just had a very nice ocean feel to it, so that's what, very peaceful. Just the sound of the wind was very nice and calming at Pilot, and it's about a 5,000 foot drop from the top of the mountain to the river down below. So just to give you an idea of how extreme the topography is there, it's a difficult place to go for a leisurely hike, because everything is down. So,
and very steep coming back up.
So we were in good shape, and we'd walk down the ridge, and the spring was about 3/4 to a mile away, and then we'd fill up our backpacks, 5 gallons of water, fill up our backpacks, haul the water back up to the top of the mountain. So that was good exercise.
we did that on our first year. We made the kind of novice mistake of just thinking that we could just like casually take a hike down to the river, down to the South Fork, and it's 5 miles down, which in concept it doesn't sound like a whole lot, but we made the descent pretty well, even though it was through lots of snags, and again you walk through those meadows of wildflowers, which is beautiful, but there's a lot of downfall and snags. You're climbing over them, and then you get down to the bottom, and it's 20 degrees hotter than it is up top, which you also don't realize. You don't realize how much cooler the top of the mountain is. So we got down there, and we were just drenched in sweat. It felt like it was 100 degrees. And we just drank in the water, and then we reluctantly turned around and started to climb back up. But it took us like 10 to 12 hours to get back up that mountain. It felt like we got back there very late, and I probably broke down a couple times in tears, and he had to drag me up, just give me moral support to kind of clamber over the snags. But that was just a good introductory to how harsh the terrain is. It looks rolling and scenic, and really there's a lot of brush and just downfall, and so yeah, that was a very humbling experience. So we never did that again the same way, but you pretty much stay on top of the mountain. You kind of coast along the ridge lines and stuff, but you're very much aware of how much you go down, and because you're going to have to come back up.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
you've kind of already answered this question in some ways, but what was it that drew you both to the job of a lookout, to be out, and especially to do it together at Pilot Peak?
Well, my original inspiration was some of the Adirondack hermits back in the Adirondacks. Noah John Rondeau and French Louis was this guy's name. And these were guys that just got sick of society and moved out into the woods and hunted and fished for their food, and that always fascinated me when I was a youngster. And so yeah, I was really drawn towards that, and that's what got me up on Hadley for the first time. The Hadley Mountain Fire Tower in the Adirondacks there. And then when I was there, I started getting into writers like Jack Kerouac and that gang, Philip Whalen and Gary Snyder, and they all did the fire lookouts. And they were also kind of associated with the university that I went to too, Naropa University. But those guys really inspired me as well. So that was kind of the second wave when we met. Basically we were working restaurant jobs, stuff like that, and I was like, hey, I have this idea, we ought to, go do a fire lookout, and, if we're not going to make a ton of money being, working in a restaurant, we might as well not make a ton of money and, sit on top of a mountain and, do something interesting like that. And, so we got the job, and
which is amazing. Yeah, I had never even known that there were fire lookouts, to be honest. That was until we got together. But when we had met, we were both living in the mountains and in these, you were in a wall tent at 10,000 feet, and I was in this little ramshackle little cabin trailer, just loving being in the woods and stuff. And we both knew that we could, kind of rough it in a certain regard, and we liked that aspect of things. And then when we got together, we lived in a little cabin with, no running water, just solar, just, a teeny little thing. So we knew we could handle that. But then, when you got the job as a lookout, that was really exciting. And I remember before we went up, we came across a quote from Edward Abbey that said something like, I'm totally paraphrasing, and he says it much better, but basically, if you're meant to be with someone, and if you could live in a 14 by 14 foot, one room, little place, and you're meant to be together. And we both had that, all right, can we do this? We knew we loved each other. We knew we wanted to be together. That wasn't a question, but that was kind of our little underline, can we do this?
Yeah.
And so it was really exciting to do that, actually.
Yeah, you said something along the lines of the true test of a marriage is to do a wildfire lookout together.
Yeah, that's probably more accurate. Yeah.
And then the flip side of that is the other true test of your marriage is to try and stay away from each other for 3 months a year and do separate lookouts. So we did them both, and we survived both scenarios. So I guess we're meant to be 14 years later. So.
But you definitely have no place to really run, so you get to know each other really, really well, really quick.
Yep.
So.
Yep.
Maybe you could describe now your experience working separate lookouts, and maybe if you're going out to Sheepeater, just describe the view there a little bit and what it was like to be out there alone.
Sheepeater is a little bit on a high plateau, so the land is not quite as you're not seeing that same elevation difference between Pilot was 8,000 feet, and the river's 2,100 or whatever, 3,100 thereabouts. So. But yeah, Sheepeater's kind of more of a high plateau, so the mountains are not as drastic. But you've got that, a really wide vista. I mean, you can see over into Montana and Oregon, and a good chunk of Idaho. Over into the Sawteeth and stuff, and so a slightly different feel than Pilot. It was kind of had this rubbly sort of volcanic rock to it, whereas Pilot was more of like a granite.
Yeah.
And a couple of lakes down below. So those were really beautiful to watch, and the moon reflected there and whatnot, and long ridges. So the sheep eaters, got a pretty long ridge, so you could just hang out on that ridge and go for nice walks there with a little bit of jog up and down, but it's pretty straightforward. Just hang out on that ridge and go for a nice stroll. Also very burnt. Lots of fire in that area. Typically at Sheep Eater, when fires start, because it is a wilderness area, they would go through a process of assessing the risks. If it was going to take out a historical site or a building or something like that, they'd go after it. But typically they let them burn. So it was very moon-like, dusty, and not a whole lot of vegetation. So yeah, that's kind of what that was like. It was Pilot Peak was made out of wood, and it was kind of this cool, funky. I think it was built in the 30s, right?
I forget exactly. There's a few renovations, but it was more of a classic, like L5. I forget. We have to look it up.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's nice older wood, older windows.
Yeah. And Sheep Eater's kind of a metal box on top of a building with linoleum. It was anyway. They've revamped it, so I'm sure it'll be a much nicer building. But when I lived there, it was, there's cracks in the windows and peeling linoleum on the floor, and it kind of had a trailer sort of feel to it. I won't lie, it wasn't super romantic, but I loved it. So it was perfect for me, and I didn't want anybody up there changing anything and beautifying it or anything. It was just absolutely perfect for me. So, and
just a caveat on there, like the reason too it wasn't beautified because it was in the wilderness. So you couldn't just like fly materials up. Everything had to go up
right.
on pack mules or on horses or someone hauling it up. So that's where probably was good enough.
Yeah.
For a long time.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Similar to Pilot Peak, I'd basically go down and get water a mile away, and it was a pretty hefty hike down to the spring and fill up a 5-gallon jug and then hike that back up. That would last me a couple of days usually. So that was what I would do on lunch, just for something to do, and then we'd almost hike. I mean, probably not in the morning so much, but after work when we were off duty, I would say both of us would walk, would just be what we would do for fun, is go for hikes, and less of a hike and more of a saunter. And that was what was nice about the lookout, was just being able to drop into this zone of peace and just a different vibration, because you're not being stimulated by all this stuff around you all the time. That was one of the other things that drove me to, fire lookouts was, when I was in college was, I studied religious studies with an emphasis in Tibetan Buddhism, and in Tibetan Buddhism, it's kind of like sought after. Solitude is very sought after, and it's kind of the ideal situation to have epiphanies and realizations about yourself or whatever, and your direction or the meaning of life or any of those deeper questions that, not a lot of us get a lot of time to think about nowadays, because we're so overly entertained and all that. So that was really a big drive for both of us. She also has, a meditation practice, and, we both did yoga, although my yoga didn't look quite as good as hers. Mine looked more like some man trying to hurt himself or whatever, but yeah, we would do yoga as a form of entertainment, even, just kind of a regular practice. And, even though we were up there for, this seemingly timeless time period, a really long time period, I found it very comfortable to have a routine. So I would wake up, make my coffee, breakfast in a certain way, do my practice, and there was a structure to the day. Take your lunch walk, and then you're up there and listen to a little NPR. We listen to a lot of radio up there, and
that's like the one pleasure. Well, it was pre-internet, being able to get Wi-Fi up there, but
yeah. I guess that is one thing. Nowadays the lookouts have Wi-Fi and internet and electricity, and Pilot Peak. We had a refrigerator there, propane refrigerator. I didn't have a refrigerator at Sheep Eater for the first 3 years. They finally got me one the last 2 years. So it was just a root cellar, and so you'd have all your vegetables down there and stuff. And, if you got meat, I would get one resupply the entire 3 months that I was there. So when I would go down and get meat, I would have to eat it within, the next 3 to 4 days. Otherwise, it would just spoil. So that was always a challenge, but we had fun with it. We ate a lot of potatoes. And
well, I was just gonna say that I think that was something that you're asking about before. What was like the drive kind of being up there is that we both always like valued solitude, and how to be in relationship and find that solitude, because it is, life is so busy, and and even just being together and stuff, you talk, and we enjoyed that our first year at the lookout, it's just being together all the time. And then we'd also have to like make like, okay, this is like our quiet time, or like we try and have a days where we wouldn't talk, just so we could like, just like practice like just being quiet and such. But it was very challenging, be in like one little space and then try and navigate all of those different needs. But we've always valued having solitude, and being able to do the lookout, like enabled that space to have, that peace and quiet, and that, is really unique up there, because you can kind of shut the world out, and then, we had that excuse, or, we didn't have distractions, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have social media, we didn't have all these things at our disposal, so it kind of forces you to, quiet your mind, and kind of look at your tendencies and all that stuff. So, we always valued it as like a place where we could do our personal growth and that work that, I think you're always doing throughout your life, but it feels like when you have, solitude and quiet, it like really like focuses, that time to really, clear the slate. And, I think we always felt like we could, no matter what happened throughout, our year, we could go to the lookout and then just sort of clear the slate, and clear our minds and have that time to just like press the reset button. And I think we always just valued that, and as difficult as it was sometimes to be apart, at times that the solitude was just, there's no other way in life that we could have that solitude except at the lookout,
Yeah, Thomas Merton, the Christian mystic, he talked about something called retreat, renewal, and re-entry, and that's what the lookout was for us. No matter how difficult or busy or complicated our life and society became, in the 8 or 9 months that we weren't at the lookout, we were always able to pull the plug during fire season, and it was like just you almost I've described it as it's almost like you kind of died to the world for that time period. Especially up at Sheep Eater, you got no cell. No one's calling you, and no one, there's no internet. Internet relations, and so it just all kind of stops, in a weird way, and then, usually for me, the first couple weeks could be kind of difficult, you're antsy and you're kind of chewing on whatever, had happened in the past 8 months and the larger, issues or whatever points that you had been dealing with, were kind of loud, so your mental chatter could be kind of loud for me anyway. And then after 2 weeks, I would start to find some sort of a rest and a peace and a tranquility that would usually last, till about 3 weeks before you came down, and then you'd start getting anxious about coming down and planning, what your re-entry is going to look like, and who you're going to be, when you come back to the world, which is always interesting, to interact with people too that I had, that knew you maybe in that previous 8 months, and then you go up on top of the mountain and you have all these epiphanies, and then you come back down and you feel like you're a different person and you've been changed by that experience, and then people continue to treat you as if you were the same person that went up there, which I found interesting to navigate, when I would come back to the world, and I don't know if you had that similar experience.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think because you spend so much time alone and in that quietude, especially like when you're in there for 3 months and not having, you're just not prattling, you're not like you're doing like the social interactions as much, and it feels very refreshing, I think we both would feel refreshed by it, and you actually get more precise in your mind and in your focus, and I think that's what allows you to be a good lookout, is because then you kind of quiet all that noise out, and so then when you need to press go, you're on and you can just do. But then then like you also forget, you lose some of the social cues when you come back down too. You have to re-enter, and it can sometimes be like a reverse culture shock in a way, it's like you've just been in this like kind of quiet, pristine space, and then all of a sudden you're like driving in traffic and you're like, oh my gosh, and you're in the grocery store and having like a billion different interactions with people, and it's like sensory overload, so I think when you do that, you both, look forward to coming into the world, and then you also, like, I think most lookouts that we've talked to, like, have that, like, where you're excited for worldly things, and then you also want to hold on to the lookout time as long as you can, because it's so precious, and it's like the whole world is going to be different once you get back into life again, and then also, like you were just saying, it's like how is that new you going to meet the world,
Yeah.
the part of you that feels like has changed, are you going to react in the same ways as you did before, or are you going to fall back into the same patterns? So all those things kind of come up, and they're like the little anxiety things that kind of buzz around your brain right before you leave the lookout, and you do this like tug of war, but
yeah, and you kind of come down, and it's like I think we kind of call it like the mountain glow, where you come down and like it's almost like you have this electricity about you, and everyone kind of can sense that something's different because your energy is different because you've been in that environment for such a long time. And so yeah, you'd feel like you'd definitely were changed in a certain regard. And then for me, it would usually take about 10 days, 2 weeks, kind of a similar sort of period, and then you'd be almost right back to where you were before the lookout. That glow would kind of start to fade a little bit. And I would dread coming back down. Of course, I'd be very excited to see Caroline and finally be back together again. But you'd go down to the office, at Sheepeater, I'd hike 12 miles, hop on a bush plane, and then you'd be standing in the office with these neon lights and cinder block walls and one phenomena that I've experienced is that when you're at the lookout, there's that quietude. Then you go into the office, and all you can hear, or a hotel, all you can hear is the electricity moving through the wires, and for most people, you don't recognize that stuff because we're so desensitized to it. So yeah, the lookout would definitely increase that sensitivity to the things that normal people take for granted.
Yeah, I think, we've been talking about that before. It's almost like you have the experience of, going wild, Like, you feel like you can, allow yourself to, just become more, I don't know, your sense perception changes. Like you said, perfume, you could, smell, if someone's, had some sort of, artificial perfume or shampoo or whatever. You're very aware of that stuff, but the sound of the fridge or all these little things that just you're very much aware of, but that's what is nice, to kind of drop into that wild space and to feel like you can kind of access different sensory perceptions, where your hearing is more acute, because you're always trying to be aware of your surroundings, and obviously your vision, what your perception is, I think too. I gotta look out, you're always scanning, you're constantly looking around and constantly trying to see what's on the horizon, and and you're looking at what's out there, and I think that's a little bit different than you get into your world and you're in your car and your world just shrinks, but
yeah, you kind of go back to more of a primitive way of being, when you're walking in the woods, you are using, your nose to be aware of what's going on around you, and your ears, and, if you hear something in the woods in a certain way, and just with modern life, once again, we're just so overstimulated that those subtleties get lost, I think.
yeah.
And you're hanging out with animals all the time. I mean, you're one of them, and there's no people around, and so you really do, you kind of drop into this state of being a more primitive type of person.
Yeah,
which is nice.
yeah. Sorry for going on.
Sorry for
No, that's great.
Sorry.
You answered so many of the questions that kind of I had kind of on deck too.
Cool.
Thinking about your kind of spiritual practice, and you said you were religious studies. Did you both study religion? And
In different ways, you had a specific approach, and with Tibetan Buddhism and your interest in. I had when I was 18, I had traveled to Nepal, and then had experience with Buddhism there. So and spent a lot of time alone as well. So I started my practice there, and then in Boulder there was a really active yoga community at that time, and so both the meditation and yoga were kind of part of the practice, but also being in the woods was also kind of part of it too, just part of growing up and sort of my kind of feeling of sanctuary and peace and where I prefer to be, so it's kind of all those things in one. And then the Lookout was just really great because you just didn't have the same excuses of why I'm not practicing or why I'm not doing things, so it's a lot easier to be like, okay, I'm going to, like, I have no distractions, so I'm going to wake up early and do these things, and you can really get into a routine. And I think the routine is really nice, like I think you were just talking about, like we'd both go on walks, like we'd take lunchtime walks and walks when you would get off your shift, and when there wasn't like fire danger and stuff that was happening. Like there's a lot of times you had to be on your post, but if you didn't, then you'd take that time to do that. But
yeah, so do you have, it sounds like the whole thing was a spiritual experience for you, but I'm curious if you have if there are any moments that kind of stick out over the course of your time as Lookouts that were particularly poignant, kind of maybe spiritual experiences.
I mean, probably just nothing terribly profound that you could describe in words. I think probably the most magical thing was just feeling that sense of calmness and clarity, and just letting your ordinary concerns kind of drop away, was very nice and liberating. Yeah, I mean, sometimes you just get these crazy rushes of energy, and you'd feel like, just everything's coming together and coalescing so nicely, and and a lot of times it was a lot of difficult work, where you're really like working with your mind and you can't escape yourself, and so that could be challenging at times for sure, but that's what you're there to do, is chew on all that stuff and hopefully, move in, digest it and move beyond these things that, hang you up, and that was the coolest thing about it for me, was just simply finding, some peace of mind, and yeah, I think that's about what I would say, yeah.
Yeah, right. I know it's hard to put words to some of those experiences, and I think, like for me, like when you say that, like it makes me think of, you have these experiences, in your mind, but then it's kind of validated by the natural world in some respects, so you feel like you get to this place of quietude, and then all of a sudden you like have this encounter with like an elk, or and you just feel this like just a connection with the world around you. I think a greater, deeper connection, and so those are like the things that kind of come to mind. And for me, my last year at the Lookout, I just happened to bring up some paints. I had loved painting, like as a child or in high school and that kind of thing, but had all these hang-ups about it. And what was really nice was to be up there and to like lose the whole thing about what I was producing, and it was a spiritual experience for me to kind of feel like I could get in touch with like the muse, and I feel like for the first time in my life I actually got to know what that was, or that is, and that and that I would just go on walks and then just kind of be open, and then just see where like the muse would kind of come in, where like, okay, like here's this sunset, and like just like just you just see things in a different light, and you just can't help but want to create it and express it and feel like it's touched you somehow, and so that for me was something that was really exciting because it didn't matter what I produced, and in fact then I produced some of like the best, what I feel like was the most authentic, because I wasn't concerned about that. I was just trying to kind of connect with that space and then just have fun with canvas and paint, and so that was really neat, for me personally. And I guess that's the most tangible way to kind of, I don't know, describe that space. But
Just to add to that, the animals, that was probably the most, the spiritual moments that you would have where you're just mind blown, is like being down by one of the little tiny lakes, and all of a sudden, a whole herd of elk moves through, and like that scene in Into the Wild where he's running around with the antelope and or whatever, caribou, I think they were caribou, and and you're hearing the hooves, banging on the ground and just feeling the rumble, and you're the only one out there, and for miles, for 25, 30 miles, you're the only dude, and that was pretty mind-blowing for me in that regard, and exactly, it was the connection to nature that really was like the most spiritually striking. Even the rawness of nature. One time I was up at Sheep Eater and I heard an elk screaming in the lake, and I got my binoculars out, and there was a whole herd of a whole pack of wolves down at the lake, and they had chased this calf into the lake, and so I watched them, and the pack of wolves split up. So one half stayed on one half of the lake, one half stayed on the other half of the lake, and then they ate the elk on the other side. So, just that rawness and just being in touch with that code of nature, that a lot of people really don't get to experience because, they don't put themselves in those sorts of positions, The animals were always really inspiring. It was always great to see a bear, and I saw a bear up at Pilot Peak with 2 cubs at one point, and Mama Bear stood up on her legs and was staring at me and like, you better back up. So I grabbed my dog and just kind of started backing up the hill real nice and slow like, and sure enough, a couple of cubs went squirting by her on the road, and so cool stuff like that, just neat animal energy.
yeah, that's what I would say too. Yeah, like those are the most memorable moments, because you just feel like they just happen. You don't contrive it. You don't, like you're very, you're a very small part of the happening, and that's kind of nice, And like, we're chatting about it, just remembering some of the things, like when I was at Carrie Dome Lookout, it was, it was like just the beginning of the rut, but I was on a walk, and then they had closed the road because of fires. So, that's always exciting when they do it, because then the animals actually, like, you start seeing a whole different world, open up, because you're not getting the vehicles out there. So in this case, I could hear, like, it sounded like branches, like thwack, thwack, thwack. And I came up on the ridge and looked down, and there were these 2 bull elks, and they were just sparring with each other and getting like their antlers kind of tangled, and in this beautiful dance. It wasn't like this, one was beating up on another. They were just doing their thing, and just to kind of see their world for just a minute, it just feels really sweet, and then there's no car, there's no audience, there's nothing around, so you just kind of tuck that in your mind of like, and just and you're quiet, and you're not, I don't know, not making a big deal about it, and it feels nice, just to be like a shadow in the forest a little bit, seeing those experiences.
Yeah, and neither of us are hunters. I mean, I've done a little bit here or there, but whenever I carried a gun or felt like I wanted to go hunting, it kind of changed my relationship to the animals. Where it wasn't just neutral. I wanted to get a grouse here or there, especially up at Sheep Eater, because I was hungry, eating rice and potatoes, and so yeah, I pulled a few fish out of there, the lake at times, and those were delicious. But point being, just like, it was just nice to be in nature and not want anything from it,
Yeah.
and that was kind of annoying when hunting season would open up and all of a sudden the woods are full of people who, the only reason why they came out there was to get something, and we weren't there to get anything necessarily. It was more just a state of being, and that was very satisfying.
Yeah, and you start to view them as like your friends. Like all lookouts have that experience where like the one deer that they see all the time, or you like get to know certain animals and and you kind of look for them or wait for those experiences, and you feel this sort of kinship and neighborliness. You feel like you're all kind of neighbors in this in this little community, and I think you really value that because you're the only human, and especially if you're in a more remote situation, and because we like that remoteness, we wouldn't go down to town, and we didn't want more human interaction than need be, but because it puts you in that place of just just being more animal-like than just and that was nice. That was always just a nice thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
How does it feel, or could you describe maybe the experience of kind of being out there kind of for the purpose of having this solitary, or achieving this solitary state of being, as you say, or being in kinship with the animals and the landscape, but also being like a part of this very human institution there as an observer of the landscape, working for the U.S. Forest Service, like did you feel conflicted about that, or what was it like to be doing this job at the same time that you were kind of pursuing this kind of solitary?
Yeah. Well, I would say, I think we always had profound gratitude for our jobs. So I think we always kind of felt like, okay, well, we appreciated the kind of human structure that we were a part of because it enabled us to have that experience. So I think we always just felt a certain gratitude for that. But I mean, yeah, I think it's really difficult when you're out there and your job is to spot a fire, and you get any lookout who spots a fire, you get your heart races, you get like really like jumpy and nervous, and and you want to call it in, you want to stop that fire, and the hardest thing is when they say, oh well, we're just gonna let it burn and just kind of watch it do its thing, and that has its place entirely too, and we get that, but I think that like personally would be like really hard, where you're like, really, like just keep this patch of green please, and you don't have any say in that, and there's no room for that, there's no room for discussion, like whether you think that that's an important piece of land or not, so you have to like let go of that, even though you feel a tremendous amount of ownership in a way, even though you don't own it, you're viewing it, but you feel like, oh, this is like my scene area, this is like what I'm caring for, and I can't do anything about it, I can't put it out, like I think the forest lookouts of old, they would spot a fire and they're incredible. I can't even imagine doing this, like spotting a fire, putting on your pack, and going and putting it out, and that's what they would do. And you feel that inclination, I think, to want to do that. But that's just my thought on on the agency aspect of things.
Yeah.
I don't know. What would you say of that?
Yeah, I mean, we were definitely there, for our own specific purpose of, as you say, the solitude and just dropping into that natural zone. So I did my best to spend as little time in the office as I could at the beginning of the season, and I was, GS5, the manager lookout, so I'd have to show up 2 weeks earlier and orient everybody, and by the time that 2 weeks up, I was just dying to get up on top of that hill, so.
You had to be on the radio a lot, though.
Yeah, I was on the radio a lot.
Communications and stuff, too, in that role.
Yeah, so, and that was sometimes slightly difficult because, everything you do is through the radio. So, if maybe there's a fire out there and someone says, Jim, there's a fire out there, and can you take a look for me, and and you get on the radio and you might sound excited or something like that because you don't want to miss a smoke. The last thing you want to do is be the guy who misses a smoke, and so there's always this anxiety that you were doing a good enough job, or that the bosses were happy with you and they weren't gonna take you down off the hill or whatever. So it could be hard at times when you'd second guess yourself if you accidentally said something in maybe not quite a skillful way on the radio. Then you've got nothing but like the next month and a half to think about why you said it that way and how you said it that way, and so that could be tough. But that was also part of the spiritual aspect, because not everything in life is hunky-dory all the time, so you just have to deal with those difficult voices in your head, and you wouldn't have anybody to really be able to reach out to and chat with about that and say, oh, you didn't sound like that, or you didn't come off that way, or whatever. So that was probably the most difficult part of, I wish I could toss that radio out the door, actually, and I might have enjoyed the experience more had I not been tethered to the radio all the time. And in fact, after I stopped being a lookout, I found that I enjoyed walking in the woods a lot more without having this tether, So, yeah, radio's tough.
Yeah, it's tough. Well, I was just going to add, too, just along those lines, I think on our first year that we were on the lookout together at Pilot Peak, it was a very intense year for many reasons, but in August there were a number of fires that had started on the South Fork, and one, a large fire that was just south of us by the lookout that was immediately to our south, and so she was working on this on the fire very actively. So she was on like round the clock watching this fire, and then they, her management, the management thought that she needed to get a break and come off the mountain, so there was a lot of back and forth with that, about whether she should leave. But they decided to go get her and fly up in helicopter, and then come down. And in the descent, the helicopter crashed, and all 4 people perished. And so that was something that I think was just really kind of rattled everybody, because the lookout, it was debatable whether she wanted to go down or not. And in fact, a lot of people, who were, listening to her conversations and stuff, thought that she wanted to stay up on the mountain, that it wasn't her choice, but she had to listen to the chain of command. And so, yeah, there was those things. And that happened to Jim the next year, 2007. There was a fire at the bottom of his mountain, and you were to be evacuated. And given the previous year, he wasn't excited to take a helicopter back down, So that was a back and forth with that.
Yeah. It was on the same exact day
No
as
way.
the helicopter crashed the previous year. And they sent up a helicopter to come get me. And I told them, hey, I don't think it's a good idea. And just considering all the juju around, the date and all this stuff. And, you're being, what's the word, whatever, superstitious or whatever. And so they flew out to come get me, and it was like 45 mile an hour winds, 60 mile an hour winds, something like that, totally socked in with smoke.
Pea soup conditions.
Yeah, they had about 4 people in the ship, and they couldn't land to come get me because the conditions were so bad. And it was like, well, you could have listened to me, and and the guys that were in the helicopter, talked to me about it later, and they said it was the eeriest flight that they had ever taken because you couldn't see anything around you. They were just simply flying by instruments. And so I was just telling them, hey, I'll hop in my truck and drive out of here. And being a wildfire lookout and that sort of person, you've got to be extremely independent. And so it was difficult to have somebody telling me what to do in those scenarios, or what my wife should do, or when we could even see each other and stuff like that. And, the whole agency had to be involved in these things, so that was that could be tough at times, and that's where you just learn to, just follow orders or just keep it simple for yourself too, and not try and do too much, and just listen to what they tell you.
And just what was interesting too to me, like when they came to try and get you and then couldn't land, that there was an engine crew that was down below, and they had kind of heard everything and had radioed like, hey, should we go for plan B, and of course there was no plan B, but it was just there like, well, we could go up and get Jim, and that's what they ended up doing, is just taking the road and going up and getting Jim, and and then bringing him back down. So, I think, there is a lot of like those sticky points, with like listening to chain of command, but then there's also, a lot of people who care and kind of understand the system too, and and people are trying to work together and trying to look out for each other as well.
Yeah, they're all good folks, Everyone has good intentions, and yeah, it's a good organization, especially fire. Seems like the mission, Forest Service mission has maybe it's had to change just because we're in a completely different era than maybe back in the day. But yeah, they do a good job, and they take their job seriously. So that was cool to be a part of. That level of professionality was inspiring.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would say, yeah.
Do you have any questions?
Yeah. So you both have kind of described the lookout as a site of rebirth and maybe even a kind of spiritual death at times. Almost like a snake shedding its skin, this like periodic renewal. Have you found yourselves missing that since you've stopped being lookouts?
Definitely.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I was just saying that the other day, just because we're going all the time now, we're like, we've just got with the farm and all of that, you know, we wake up and, you know, and our day's full until you fall asleep with your boots on at the end of the night, you know. So, yeah, just I often say, you know, I wish there was just like a pause button you could just press, just to kind of just get that that time, and so yeah, I do miss that opportunity to remake myself, and kind of just press the reset button is what we always used to say, you know. You just pull the plug on whatever you're doing, and that's it for 3 months, and yeah, you come out on the other side a little different.
Yeah, and I think like we'll say it to each other where it's like I could really use some like lookout time right now. You know, we know what that means. You know, like and the hard thing is it's like almost impossible to recreate that experience. You know, and I mean when we were up there, like you know, I think like we both. I mean, I'm speaking for myself. I'm speaking for you too. I think that you know felt like this is like the best job ever for that reason. You know, because you can be yourself and then also, you know, work hard and try and be good at what you're doing and at the same time like value that space and so you know it's hard to find something that you know is like that and values that, you know. I mean, you know, in our society you're supposed to be like productive, you know, every moment and just do you know, going. And as a lookout, you're more like there to be like a mountain lion, you know, like you're just kind of there to sit and wait and watch and then pounce, you know, when the time is right. And there are very few things that are kind of like that. And in that waiting time is where, you know, that's pretty precious.
Yeah, and I did a lot more reading up there.
Yeah.
I mean, I probably read, you know, 20 books a season, you know, and hefty ones, you know, and be able to think about it and, you know, and really digest it, you know.
Yeah.
And yeah, it doesn't happen quite the same way here, you know. I'll read a couple of pages and then, you know, and then that's just about it. But at the lookout, you'd look forward to that time, so you'd go up there with a huge stack of books of what you wanted to dive into, and yeah, that was a really nice aspect of it,
Yeah.
for sure.
And I mean, we were definitely on like that end of the spectrum. Like there's some lookouts that like to go down to town and like to, you know, visit people or you know, like having people come up and stuff. And we're always like the lookouts that were like, you know, we want to be as far away from people. We want to like get as much food as we can, you know, have so we don't have to come down to town. You know, like we just cherish that space so much that we just did everything that we could just to try and hold on to that space because it is so rare. But yeah, we definitely I think if we could live dual lives, you know, if there were, you know, there were a way to kind of like have this, and fortunately you can't have goats and and do a lookout at the same time. But
Yeah.
if we could, we would definitely do it. You know.
And a big impetus for us leaving, you know, the lookout was just we were apart for 3-4 months a year,
Yeah.
and that got old, you know.
Yeah.
And when you start, you know, you just you start getting older, and you're like, well, shoot, we're missing every single summer together. That's kind of not fun.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so that's nice to be back
Yeah.
together and all of that,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
I mean, if I didn't have all these creatures to take care of, you know, I still think about it, you know. I've had opportunities to do, you know, stints on different mountains and whatnot, and you know, I've been invited back to do that, you know. So that might just happen where I go up and do a month or a couple weeks and relieve somebody, but yeah, our life has definitely changed, you know, with all these animals. So
Yeah, and just something I would add too, I think what we were both also feeling was a certain insecurity about our roles as lookouts in the Forest Service too, you know, where you feel like as a lookout you're kind of competing with the aircraft for fire detection, you know, so it was almost like you almost have like this like little, game as a lookout where you're trying to beat the planes, because you know that the planes are like, they have all the advantage, in so many ways. They can kind of fly around and get to where they want to go. So, your advantage is just being on top of things so much, and watching. But yeah, we were just starting to get nervous about, how long, how long the Forest Service would keep doing that. And I think that's where we always tried to be low maintenance. That was always a big thing, just like not be a problem, and just try and be really good and effective at what you're doing, because I think there's tremendous value. I mean, we always felt like there was tremendous value, in humans being up there and, having that role. But we were getting nervous whether, the organization would still keep valuing it. So.
And we got the Bergdorf gig, so that was pretty hard to pass up. And Bergdorf is, right near the mountains, so it was an opportunity for us to live in those mountains, full time, year round. And that was also a difficult part about the lookout, was you'd have to come back to society and try and find a job,
right.
And who wants to hire somebody for, once you got settled, you'd have another 4 or 5 months, where you're looking for work, and no one would want to hire you because they knew you were going to go back to the lookout. And so that got to be a little challenging. And Bergdorf was just too cool to pass up. It's a really neat spot. So
yeah, that's what we always said. We'd have to find something that was like as good as the lookout to leave, because we never wanted to leave. We really felt like we wanted to do it forever.
Yep.
But
Can you just elaborate on what you think is lost in the transition away from the human fire lookout toward aerial surveillance as the primary means of fire detection?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's so many different aspects of it. Obviously, just like a cultural heritage, is just really important to, have the history there and someone maintaining that. But having a person out in the woods, we found ourselves in different situations, being needed as communication relays for different plane crashes that were in the backcountry, and communications would break down, and there would only be a lookout to be able to make that happen. So we both found ourselves in those positions at different points in time. Also there would always be, people getting lost, or there were always incidents of other, campers, or just people out in the backcountry that just, needed somebody there, and whether that's like as a communications relay or just as somebody that could help, because it's so difficult when you're out there. If someone breaks a leg, how are they gonna, notify somebody, and when you don't have cell service and you don't have a sat phone. So anyway, there every summer there was always something that would come up. There's always emergencies that were human related, definitely. And what else am I missing? And then too, you're up there monitoring all the conditions. So for instance, you get a thunderstorm, or a storm system coming through, and you see the activity of lightning, and obviously lightning maps can pick that stuff up too, but you're aware of what really got hit. There's like a little bolt here, and then there's one that just, you could see when something gets really zapped, and you're like, I got to keep my eye over there. And that it's really dry, or you're kind of aware of what the conditions are out there, and your visual eyes out there. We would get calls from our managers saying like, what are the clouds looking like? What are the conditions looking like out there? And you're the eyes for the office, and perhaps you could get a camera and get a visual, but you're not getting the whole experience, and I think a person could kind of, if they're aware and can communicate effectively, that, you can just give more of an accurate description as to what's going on in the backcountry in some of these areas, and planes are expensive, aircraft is really expensive to get out there, and humans are actually can be fairly inexpensive, yeah, considering, but
yeah, I'd say all that's true,
Hold on a sec. I just need to